Evelyn Ellington, my future mother-in-law, loves to define success exclusively by visible, extravagant consumption, by the blinding shimmer of diamond jewelry, the depth of a person's infinity pool, and the undeniable heft of their address. She insists, with the absolute conviction of someone who mistakes inherited status for personal achievement, that anyone failing to achieve that level of external opulence is simply incomplete, a placeholder in the social hierarchy, a temporary, embarrassing blight on the pristine landscape of her daughter's relentlessly aspirational life. This belief system was applied ruthlessly and without exception to every single one of my choices, from the modest 9-year-old sedan I still drove, to the brand of coffee I preferred, which she once loudly deemed dangerously proletariat, and most painfully, to the modest, intentionally sparse apartment I called home. That apartment, tucked away discreetly in a dense, prime neighborhood, was the primary target of her constant, corrosive mockery, the place she delighted in dismissing as James's charmingly inconvenient little box of potential, a verbal slight intended to belittle both my current circumstances and my perceived lack of ambition. Today, at exactly 7:45 in the evening, standing here in the harshly lit, aggressively formal, and cavernous dining room of the prestigious Hawthorne Country Club, where the engagement party is reaching its deafening, champagne-fueled crescendo, that inconvenient little box just became the master key to their entire, carefully maintained financial existence. And the first order of business for me, the ridiculed box tenant, is very simple. Use that key to lock them out of their own assumed, entitled privilege, making sure the entire room watches as the realization dawns on them. Evelyn is standing precisely 6 feet away from me right now. She is, predictably, radiant in a shimmering sapphire gown that cost more than I spend on food in a year, and accessorized with a colossal, ostentatious diamond necklace that I recognized immediately as a loaner from a high-end jeweler friend of Richard's. Her hands are clasped delicately over a glass of vintage cristal, vibrating ever so slightly with a profound and familiar self-satisfaction. Her face, however, which just moments ago held the serene, beatific glow of the triumphant matriarch who finally secured a moderately wealthy professional for her daughter, has suddenly shifted. It's gone to the sallow, sickly white of absolute, terrifying, and immediate comprehension. Next to her, Richard, my future father-in-law, looks merely confused, perhaps wondering if the caterers missed a crucial detail or if the stock market had experienced a sudden, inexplicable afternoon crash. But let's be absolutely clear. Evelyn's rapid, unsettlingly wide-eyed stare isn't reflecting spiritual illumination or overwhelming maternal pride. These are the wide, panicked, and rapidly drying eyes of social and logistical ruin. She has just realized that the man she spent the better part of a year systematically ridiculing, the man whose professional value and material achievements she consistently and deliberately negated to elevate her own flimsy narrative of inherited old-guard wealth, is the very same man who holds the literal, undisputed majority share in the corporate entity that owns their primary residence, the building Richard's failing law firm occupies, and, most satisfyingly, the entire land parcel beneath this very country club. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To fully understand the profound, systemic magnitude of the social and financial devastation about to cascade over the Ellington family in front of their most esteemed peers, you need to know the entire, complete story. You need to fully understand the year of deliberate, almost surgical cruelty. You need to grasp precisely how a man they continually dismissed as a struggling renter, a sadly simple minimalist, and a fiscally conservative bore, silently and patiently acquired a complete financial stranglehold over their entire lifestyle, purely to secure my fiancé's peace and future stability, and then waited with the patience of a geological shift for the precise, inevitable moment his tormentors would make their single, fatal, public error. My name is James Hawthorne. 2 years ago, I met Clara Ellington, a woman whose genuine, unassuming kindness, quiet intellectual prowess, and essential good nature were unfortunately overshadowed by her deep, almost crippling anxiety concerning her parents' impossibly rigid, unmovable standards of social presentation. Clara was 32 then, a brilliant, talented architect burdened not just by her own aspirations, but by the relentless, crushing pressure of maintaining and eventually inheriting her family's legacy, a legacy she kept truthfully proclaiming was financially stuck in the late 90s, clinging desperately to paper valuation, while simultaneously remaining tragically dependent on its superficial, highly visible stability. To the outside world, the Ellingtons, Richard, the corporate lawyer, and Evelyn, the society fixture, were the picture of entrenched, old-money grace and authority. They were demanding. They were visible. They were exhausting. But Richard and Evelyn didn't actually want a son-in-law. They wanted a significant, undeniable socio-economic upgrade for their daughter, and failing that, They wanted a completely disposable, non-threatening partner whose palpable lack of external ambition would make Clara look dramatically more impressive by comparison. The systematic marginalization and humiliation started the instant they felt comfortable enough to ask for my current address. We were sitting formally in the aggressively antique dining room of their massive, inefficient, and drafty estate, a sprawling, deeply mortgaged Federalist monstrosity that reeked faintly of mothballs and desperate maintenance. I had just finished answering Richard's invasive questions about my profession, which I described simply as property management and diversified infrastructure logistics, deliberately downplaying the scale. I was showing Clara my modest, though highly effective, personal investment portfolio, which was focused heavily on stable, long-term infrastructure holdings. It wasn't designed to be flashy or exciting, but it was aggressive, purchased meticulously with entirely clean money I had earned through nearly 2 decades of grueling, anonymous logistical work and shrewd land acquisition. On that very first night, Richard cornered me near the mahogany liquor cabinet, eyeing my simple suit with unmistakable suspicion. "So, James," Richard began, swishing a ridiculously expensive single malt, "Clara tells us you live, downtown? In a converted unit." I nodded easily, taking a sip of sparkling water. "Yes. It's a fantastic location. The commute is negligible." Richard offered a weak, dismissive chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Negligible. Right. Well, we were hoping for something a bit more substantial for Clara. Something reflecting security. We live in a world where appearances matter, James. Where you live often dictates who you are. How many bedrooms are we talking about in this converted unit?" "1," I replied calmly, "with a study. And 2 bathrooms." Evelyn, who had glided silently up behind us, placed a perfectly manicured hand on Richard's arm, her eyes wide with what I recognized immediately as performative pity. "Oh, darling. 1 bedroom. That's so bohemian. So charmingly temporary. Richard, did you hear that? James is quite the minimalist. It must be difficult hosting business clients in such a constrained space." We, of course, assumed Clara would move into something more fitting for a future Ellington. That was the first clear statement of expectation. I was required to abandon my life, my home, and my professional identity to step into the role they had already scripted for me, the non-threatening, slightly less impressive foil to their glamorous daughter. They had mistaken my contentment with my simple, efficient lifestyle for poverty, or worse, for a lack of ambition. They believed I had to live in that small apartment because I couldn't afford anything better, when in reality, I lived there by choice. It offered perfect anonymity, zero maintenance, and was an integral part of my largest holding company's diversified residential portfolio. I didn't argue. I didn't point out that the rent I paid went directly back into my own corporate coffers. Instead, I accepted the role of the non-threatening background figure. I continued to work from my deliberately sparse, tiny apartment, reinforcing the illusion that I was barely scraping by, a dedicated but ultimately small-time logistics professional. This deception was crucial. While Evelyn was busy ordering customized engagement stationery and mocking my worn leather briefcase, my company, Hawthorne Property Solutions, HPS, was quietly consolidating control. HPS didn't just manage properties. It acquired and managed the complex, often politically sensitive, infrastructure logistics required to keep entire cities running, everything from commercial warehousing distribution centers outside major metropolitan areas to the long-term leases on residential blocks in prime locations. In my cramped study, late at night, I was signing contracts for 9-figure deals, systematically funneling every cent of profit from these operations into secure, untraceable holding trusts and special-purpose vehicles, SPVs. I was buying land. I was buying buildings. And I was buying the debt that held those buildings together. While Richard stressed about the quarterly dividend payout on his outdated, slow-moving portfolio, I was engineering a complex, layered empire. I lived well below my visible means, meticulously allowing them the continued illusion of my financial constraint while my true wealth ballooned beneath the surface. My simple life was not poverty. It was a perfect, protective camouflage. By the time I proposed to Clara 6 months ago, Hawthorne Property Solutions, through its complex web of subsidiaries and interlocking land trusts, had a verified, audited valuation in excess of $320 million. Critically, because of Richard's law firm's desperate need for tax write-offs and Evelyn's insistence on living exclusively in high-profile, high-tax bracket neighborhoods, the Ellingtons were tenants, not owners, in several of their key lifestyle pillars. Specifically, their cherished Federalist estate was part of a large residential trust managed by HPS Residential Holdings, LLC. Richard's high-rise law firm office space was leased from HPS Commercial Infrastructure. Even this sprawling country club, where Evelyn was currently holding court and detailing my perceived inadequacies to anyone who would listen, was built on land leased by a shell corporation I had purchased 5 years prior as a long-term passive income investment. And absolutely nobody knew. Evelyn thought I was a small-time residential manager. Richard thought I was just competent enough to make his daughter stable, but definitely not powerful enough to challenge his status. The turning point came 4 months ago, during the planning of the wedding itself. Evelyn decided that the wedding should be held at a lavish coastal venue, followed by an extended 2-week honeymoon, all to be paid for entirely by me, the convenient, fiscally responsible one. "James, darling, we need a spectacular launch for Clara," Evelyn announced over a dry martini, not asking, but dictating. "You simply cannot expect her to start her married life in that one-bedroom dungeon. We need a proper foundation. We need the wedding to reflect the prestige of the Ellington name, and frankly, James, you need to step up and provide the means to match our social standing." "I hear you, Evelyn," I said, putting down my teacup. "A proper foundation. What exactly does a proper foundation entail, financially?" Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "Terms. Don't be vulgar, James. It entails providing the means while we manage the social presentation. You're barely making ends meet with your small-time property rentals. This wedding is your chance to prove you're worthy of the Ellington name. You pay for the expense. We provide the glory." I nodded slowly, letting the insult settle. "I apologize for quantifying, Evelyn. Of course, I will provide the foundation." And then I went to my dungeon apartment, locked the study door, and made a single, crucial call to Jeremy Wells, my general counsel. "Jeremy," I instructed, "Evelyn is demanding a massive financial commitment for the wedding and simultaneously insisting that I am socially and financially beneath them. I need you to prepare 2 things. First, finalize the documentation on all Ellington-related properties under HPS management. I want specific, enforceable clauses regarding breaches of rental agreements and lease terms for both the residential trust and Richard's commercial lease." "Noted, James. What's the play? You want to evict them?" Jeremy asked, sounding amused. "Not yet," I clarified. "I want the means to execute an immediate legal displacement in less than 30 minutes. I want to honor Evelyn's desire for the truth. I want to honor her public definition of me as an insignificant financial entity. She is about to do something catastrophically embarrassing during her engagement party toast, and I want to be the one holding the signed, notarized paperwork when she does." Over the next few months, I played the financially constrained, eager-to-please future son-in-law perfectly. I agreed to the lavish budget. I signed the checks, making sure to use a visibly nondescript bank account to maintain the facade of modest savings. Jeremy and I, however, also meticulously crafted a series of financial confirmation agreements tied to the wedding expenses. I told Evelyn and Richard that, due to the magnitude of the expense I was incurring, I required a simple, formal document stating that the Ellingtons acknowledged my financial contributions and recognized my stable professional standing. This was, I insisted, purely for my tax and fiduciary responsibility purposes, a claim that Richard, obsessed with tax avoidance, readily accepted. The final document they both signed was an affirmation of familial respect and professional standing. It stated, specifically, that in consideration of my substantial financial contribution to the wedding, they formally affirmed my status as a financially solvent and esteemed family figure. Crucially, Jeremy had included a clause: any deliberate, public denouncement, mockery, or systemic negation of James Hawthorne's financial standing or professional capacity would trigger an immediate, irrevocable breach of the agreement, resulting in the legal invalidation of all secondary contracts tied to HPS properties. They signed it without reading the fine print. They were convinced my professional standing was worth the price of a temporary lie on paper. Tonight, the engagement party has been in full swing for hours. The toasts have just begun. Richard gave a long, rambling speech about Ellington excellence. And then Evelyn, the self-proclaimed empress of social hierarchy, took the microphone. She thanked her darling Clara, her hard-working Richard, and all the dear friends who help us maintain the exacting standards of our life. She paused, taking a slow, dramatic breath. She looked right through me, my placement at the corner table designated for family friends, already signaling my distance. "And finally," Evelyn announced, her voice perfectly modulated, "I must thank James. James, you have been a lesson in resourcefulness. You have shown Clara that ambition isn't always about massive, external displays of wealth. Sometimes, it's about providing quiet, functional stability from the periphery. You have managed to provide the financial cushion for this spectacular party, despite your humble beginnings. We are grateful for the support from your simple, functional corner of the world. Now, Clara, your job is to pull James out of that charming little box and elevate him to the life he deserves, the life of a true Ellington." The laughter rippled through the room. It was not gentle. It was mocking. Evelyn's smile was triumphant. I let the applause and the laughter die down completely. I waited until the silence in the enormous dining room was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of ice. Then, I stood up from my chair at the periphery table, adjusted the bespoke suit they didn't know I owned, picked up the small black portfolio I had placed discreetly beneath my seat, and walked deliberately toward the elevated podium where Evelyn stood, still basking in the glow of her final insult. I reached the microphone stand, tapped it once gently, and my voice, calm, amplified, and carrying the undeniable weight of 10 years of deferred authority, echoed throughout the stunned silence of the room. "Before we raise our glasses for the final toast," I announced, my voice completely steady, "I, the self-proclaimed tenant of the simple, functional corner of the world, have a necessary clarity to provide." Evelyn took a distinct step back, her triumphant smile faltering. "James, what are you doing? This is utterly out of time." "On the contrary, Evelyn," I said, opening the black portfolio deliberately. "There is absolutely no better time. I am here to honor your commitment to the precise truth of our circumstances." "James, sit down immediately," Richard hissed from the front table, half rising from his chair, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. "Don't you dare create a scene." I ignored Richard completely, keeping my eyes locked firmly on Evelyn. "You described me, moments ago, as a source of quiet, functional stability from the periphery, despite my humble beginnings. You have spent the last 4 months accepting tens of thousands of dollars in financial commitments for this event under the absolute legal condition that you acknowledge my stable, professional standing and respected role within the family. And yet, to this esteemed congregation, you just declared my home a charming little box, and me a figure requiring elevation." "It was just a joke, James," Evelyn stammered, her voice starting to rise in a frantic pitch. "A figure of speech." "Arthur, stop. You're ruining everything we've worked for." "I am clarifying everything," I corrected her, my tone turning to cold steel. "You wanted the money, but you wanted the victim narrative. You wanted the prestige without acknowledging the provider. You cannot, Evelyn, have both." I pulled the first, thick document from the portfolio. "This is the affirmation of familial respect and professional standing, which you and Richard both signed on October 1st. It stipulates that I am an esteemed family figure. You just publicly violated that affirmation." I raised the second document, a single, sharp page. "This is the breach of contract and notice of lease termination. As of precisely 7:48 p.m., the exact moment the phrase, 'charming little box,' was uttered, all conditions of the affirmation have been violated. My general counsel, who is currently awaiting my confirmation via text message, has already executed the transactions." "What transactions?" Richard finally spoke up, his voice dangerously cracked, pushing past Clara, who was watching in horror. "James, wait. What are you talking about?" "Transactions." I looked at Richard with a cold, devastating pity that settled heavy in the air. "I am talking about the 3 commercial and residential leases your family currently occupies, Richard, including the Federalist house you call home, which is owned entirely by HPS Residential Holdings, and including the commercial space currently occupied by Ellington and Associates Law." I delivered the final blow, my voice echoing the authority of the $320 million portfolio I silently commanded. "Since I am, in your words, only a simple renter from the periphery, I owe you nothing more than a formal legal notice. The properties you rely on are no longer available. Consider this your 30-day notice, Richard." "And Evelyn," The locks on the Federalist estate are being changed as we speak." The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a pressurized vacuum, the kind that precedes structural failure. Richard, my father-in-law, didn't just hear the words, he physically absorbed them. His face, moments ago puffed up with the self-satisfied arrogance of a man who believed his social position was divinely guaranteed, now collapsed into a gray, sagging mask. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been abruptly severed, leaving only slack material and empty menace. He attempted a legal defense, the habit of 3 decades of corporate law kicking in, but the attempt was pathetic. You cannot unilaterally terminate 3 established commercial and residential contracts, James." Richard sputtered, pushing away the terrified Clara. He was trying to project authority, planting his feet wide, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "This is malicious interference. We have tenancy rights. This will be tied up in litigation for years." I allowed a slow, pitying smile to curve my lips, the kind of smile reserved for someone who has just brought a flimsy toy sword to a nuclear detonation. I held up the 3rd document, crisp and official, illuminated by the recessed lighting of the venue. "Litigation, Richard?" I queried, my voice amplified and calm, cutting through the horrified murmurs of the assembled elite who were watching their social hierarchy violently disintegrate. "I spent the last 7 years ensuring that HPS Residential Holdings operates with a precision you wouldn't comprehend in a lifetime of drafting contracts for mid-level banking mergers. Do you truly believe that the CEO who controls a real estate portfolio valued, as of yesterday's close, at $320 million, would overlook the fundamental lease agreements governing 3 of his most strategically managed properties?" I tapped the paper sharply. "This document is the termination checklist, Richard. It itemizes every single clause, every fine print waiver, every explicit breach of the familial agreement and professional conduct stipulation you and Evelyn signed. You violated the non-disparagement clause pertaining to the majority shareholder of your landlord, Richard. Repeatedly. And most recently, publicly, in a room full of potential clients and associates." I let the magnitude of the number, $320 million, sink into the room. $320 million. The number stood in stark, brutal contrast to the charming little box they had scorned just minutes prior. The guests, sophisticated figures accustomed to calculating risk and opportunity, now looked at me with a dawning horror that transcended mere social awkwardness. It was the realization that they had fundamentally misjudged the gravity and power of the man standing before them. The silence in the room became less about shock and more about calculating who among them had been so careless as to repeat Evelyn or Richard's dismissive remarks about me in the past. Evelyn, finally understanding that her parents' entire life support, their home, her father's firm, and the family's wealth illusion, was now sitting in the hands of the man she had marginalized, let out a choked, desperate sound. She lunged, not toward me, but toward Richard, clutching his arm. "Daddy, do something. He's lying. He's just James. He rents that tiny place. He's bluffing." The repetition of the insult, the very thing that triggered this catastrophe, only reinforced my resolve. I focused my gaze on Evelyn, who was now trembling violently, the expensive lace of her gown seeming cheap and ephemeral under the glare of the lights. "Evelyn," I said, ensuring my voice was low, authoritative, and utterly devoid of emotion. "The charming little box you mocked is the single piece of residential property I hold directly in my own name, for the purposes of proving a simple truth, that financial security and personal value are entirely separate concepts. The rest, the Federalist estate, the commercial buildings in the financial district, the industrial logistics hubs across the state, and the 10,000 units of rental property generating the revenue that made HPS what it is entirely held by the holding company. A company, Evelyn, that I founded, control, and whose legal agreements you publicly violated tonight." Richard stepped forward again, desperation replacing his earlier bluster. Wait, James. We can fix this. It was a joke. A poor attempt at humor. We'll sign anything. We will issue a public retraction." "No, Richard," I cut him off, shaking my head slowly. "Clarity is expensive. And in this case, the price of clarity is absolute separation. You taught Evelyn, and I let you, that relationships are merely logistical transactions built on financial utility. You deemed me low status, because my primary residence did not meet your inherited standard of grandeur. You have mistaken my quiet competence for weakness. You have mistaken my humility for poverty. You wanted to define me by the four walls of my physical address. Tonight, I define you by the imminent loss of yours." I looked pointedly at Clara, who was weeping silently into her hands, the only person in the immediate family who seemed to possess a shred of genuine remorse, perhaps for enabling her parents' monstrous behavior. "Clara, I genuinely regret your collateral damage, but enabling entitlement has consequences. You had 18 months to defend me. You chose to defend their illusion instead." Then I turned back to Evelyn. This was the hardest part, the definitive surgical severing of the relationship I had, foolishly, hoped might become real. "Evelyn, you claimed in your toast that my role was purely functional, quiet stability from the periphery. I was willing to fund your life, your parents' prestige, and your entire future on the sole condition of receiving basic professional respect and familial acknowledgement. You failed that condition spectacularly, not just tonight, but systematically throughout our time together." She started shaking her head, the tears finally flowing, smearing her perfect makeup. "No, James, please. I love you. I thought it was just a silly agreement. It was just paper. We needed the money, James, and you were too focused on the company, on that tiny apartment. I thought you didn't care." Her accusation was the ultimate insult, echoing the familiar entitlement of the narrative, confusing financial constraint with emotional neglect. "You thought I didn't care?" I repeated, letting the profound cynicism of her statement hang heavy in the air. "I have spent the last 7 years meticulously securing every facet of your safety, building a legacy that would shield you from every financial disaster. I lived below my means, in that charming little box, to funnel every spare dollar into expanding the portfolio, ensuring that HPS was an impenetrable fortress of wealth. I did this while you and your parents ridiculed my shoes, my car, and my home office. I cared enough to secure your freedom, Evelyn. You cared only enough to mock the source of that security." I paused, absorbing the scene, Richard scrambling for his phone, frantically trying to reach his corporate lawyer, only to realize that the lawyer's office space was also owned by HPS Commercial. Evelyn, dissolving into theatrical despair, desperately seeking pity from the horrified guests. I took a breath, the physical act of releasing the burden of years of silent resentment. I reached into my portfolio for the final document, a single, heavy sheet of vellum. "Since I am deemed a temporary fixture, a transient tenant demanding rent in the sacred house of your life," I quoted, echoing the model's central motif of disposable family figures, "I have taken steps to formalize my exit from this arrangement, ensuring that the legacy I built is secured for those who value authenticity over appearances." I held up the document. "This is the declaration of full transfer. HPS Residential Holdings is not merely a rental company. It is the primary holding entity for the James Ellington Foundation, established 6 years ago. The Foundation's sole mandate is the quiet distribution of wealth to organizations focusing on educational equity and genuine, demonstrable professional mentorship." I paused for maximum effect. As of this morning, anticipating this exact outcome, I executed the final transfer of all my personal shares and controlling interest in HPS and its subsidiaries to the Foundation's Board of Trustees. While I retain a non-compensated advisory role, the majority control, that $320 million portfolio, is now legally beyond my immediate personal command and, crucially, beyond your family's reach or future influence. A collective gasp swept through the room. This wasn't just losing a house. This was watching a fortune vanish into philanthropy, entirely out of spite and necessity. "You gave away hundreds of millions." Richard choked out, unable to comprehend such a deliberate rejection of power for the sake of vengeance. "No, Richard." I redirected it toward people who understand that true value lies in contribution, not consumption. I protected it from those who mistake an asset for a birthright. The James Ellington Foundation will continue its work, supporting ambitious young professionals from humble origins, the kind of origins you disdain. I will continue my mentorship there, ensuring that the legacy of my hard work serves its intended purpose. I laid the final, weighty document down on the lectern, right next to the microphone. "In conclusion, Evelyn, your assessment was correct in one thing. I am no longer a man of means striving for acceptance from your circle. I am merely a simple renter from the periphery, in my charming little box, who happens to control the financial infrastructure supporting the entire professional and residential life of your immediate family. And now, I have elected to cease that support." I looked at the assembled guests, who were now frozen, unwilling to make eye contact. Ladies and gentlemen, my deepest apologies for the interruption. But clarification, when delivered with full legal authority, requires immediate attention. Enjoy the remainder of your evening. I trust the value of integrity will be thoroughly debated during dinner. I executed the final defining action, pulling out my keys, not the keys to a luxury SUV, but the humble fob to the modest car I drove daily, and turned away from the elevated stage. Richard collapsed into the nearest chair, his face slick with panic, his hands shaking too violently to dial his phone. Evelyn rushed the lectern, frantically picking up the termination notices, her sobs turning into desperate, raw screams of denial. I did not break stride. I walked down the aisle, the sea of affluent faces parting around me. The silence was palpable, but beneath it, I could hear the faint, distant ringing of my phone, my general counsel confirming that the final, critical steps had been executed and the locks were indeed being changed at the Federalist estate. I pushed open the massive double doors of the venue and stepped into the crisp, cool night air. The oppressive, stale humidity of that room, filled with 10 years of stifled resentment, lifted immediately. I reached the curb and pulled out my personal phone, dialing the one number that mattered. James. A clear, steady voice answered. It was Leo, a 19-year-old engineering student from a low-income background whose tuition and living expenses I had quietly covered for the last 3 years, mentoring him on logistics strategy every Sunday morning. "Hey, Leo," I said, a genuine warmth flooding my voice that had been absent for nearly a decade. I looked down the street at my reliable, unpretentious sedan, feeling an immense, immediate likeness. "I'm leaving the reception. I have the next few weeks completely clear. How about we finally go look at that factory floor in Detroit? The one you wanted to study for your capstone project?" Leo's breath hitched on the other end. "Seriously? That's huge, James. I didn't think you'd find the time." "I have all the time in the world now, Leo," I confirmed, opening my car door. "I've just completed the final, necessary transaction to secure my freedom. I've realized that the most valuable asset isn't the size of your portfolio, but the quality of the people you choose to invest your time in." I started the engine, the familiar, comforting purr a sharp contrast to the high-stakes melodrama I had just exited. I glanced back briefly at the imposing, brightly lit venue, imagining the chaos unfolding inside, the inevitable recriminations and the brutal reality dawning on Richard and Evelyn that the simple man they mocked was their entire financial ceiling. I smiled, a slow, deep sense of satisfaction settling over me. They wanted clarity. They wanted independence. They wanted to define me as a stranger. Tonight, I had merely honored their wishes, securing my vast resources for a future built not on inherited entitlement, but on genuine, earned merit. The tiny apartment was just that, tiny. But it was mine. And the $320 million, now safely beyond their grasping hands, was now dedicated to building futures far more worthy than theirs. I put the car in drive and pulled away, the legacy of James Ellington, the simple renter, finally liberated from the suffocating grasp of the entitled elite.